Hi, this is Jenna Hodge, and this is my final presentation PowerPoint to go along with my final paper. For the sake of it only being 5 to 6 minute long presentation, I am going to only talk about a select amount of information. I don't think I could fit it all into 5 to 6 minutes if I tried. So I will obviously have a lot more information in my paper that I wasn't able to include here in the presentation. So the 4 different types of information that can be obtained from examining physical evidence. You can determine a crime has been committed. You can determine the identity of the person who committed that crime. You can also corroborate a victim's testimony, and you can exonerate someone who is innocent. So for examples, I chose, in the case of a murder, if you find a dead body and lots of blood splatter everywhere, you can determine that the crime has been committed, obviously. In regards to determining the identity of the person who did it, fingerprints and DNA are very specific to only one person. So no two people have the same, not even identical twins. So this will help you narrow down the identity of the person who did it. There are databases you can upload the information to. There's just a lot with technology to help determine the identity of the person, especially if you do have that DNA and the fingerprints. As far as corroborating a victim's testimony, there is also DNA in that. So if somebody was sexually assaulted, you do have the buccal swabs, the vaginal secretion, and semen still within the system to be able to link that back to the assaulter and the person who did that. It can also exonerate someone who's innocent, so somebody who has been wrongfully convicted of a crime, and then later on down the line there's reprocessing, there's DNA analysis, there's a lot more options as far as being able to back that up. And then it can very easily determine that the person who is in jail did not commit that crime, that the DNA did not link him to that crime. So that is those. I'm going to be talking about the handguns as well. Handguns are a very small barreled gun that's initially designed to be handled and shot with one hand. For accuracy and stability purposes, a lot of people choose to shoot with two hands, which I personally am not a gun person, so if I was to shoot a gun, I would not feel comfortable shooting one with one hand, so I understand that. Pistols are a non-revolver type handgun. They are also, there's pistols, revolvers, and rifles are the 3 categories of guns. And so for pistols, they're a non-revolver handgun, meaning they're semi-automatic. They have a spring-loaded magazine that feeds them into the chamber, and then the shells at that point, the shell casings, are ejected from the gun when you shoot it. So these are often found at crime scenes, and they will continue, unless the shooter retrieves them from the crime scene, the crime scene investigators will find them and collect them for evidence. A revolver is the other type, like I mentioned. They incorporate a revolving cylinder, so they don't expel the shell casings once you shoot them. They are kept inside of the cylinder. If there is a shooting, it's very unlikely that you're going to find, unlikely and almost sometimes impossible that you're going to find a revolver bullet at a crime scene. I mean, there's always exceptions to that, like somebody is emptying out the casings to put in more, or maybe somebody left a gun behind that had them in it. But oftentimes, if you have a shooting and you can't find bullets, it's either because it's a revolver or because they picked up the bullets, the shell casings. There's also two types of revolvers. There's a single action and a double action. The difference between the two is that the single action requires manual cocking, whereas the double action only requires you to pull the trigger at that point. Rifles are held with two hands. They're placed upon the shoulder. There are many different types of rifles, such as single shot, bolt action, semi-automatic, and automatic. The semi-automatic operates in a very similar manner as the pistol, the semi-automatic pistol. The automatics, however, will fire as long as the trigger is being held, and there's ammunition within the barrel. Their fingerprints. There are three different types of fingerprints: plastic, patent, latent fingerprints. All of them are very commonly found at crime scenes, and you do have to be very careful to ensure that you get them all. Plastic fingerprints have come into contact with soft materials such as paint, blood, soap, dust, wax, you name it. They're often more visible, and they very rarely need additional processing. They're documented via oblique photography. You do have patent fingerprints that are extremely visible, and they're noticeable due to coming into contact with colored materials such as ink, paint. These prints do not require additional processing, as they are very recognizably fingerprints at that point. Latent fingerprints, these are the ones that are that do need additional processing. They are either they're not fully done or they are extremely difficult to see. They may appear invisible or translucent, but they are there. They're still there, and they still are leaving residue behind. So it is important to make sure that when you're going through the crime scene and you're getting all this evidence and information and things like that, that you don't miss that, because they are hard to see. They're not super obvious, and I think that could be why people sometimes miss them, but they do have the ability to implicate the suspect and help with the prosecution of a guilty person. So it is important to be mindful of latent fingerprints when you're going through the crime scene. Controlled substances, these are drugs that are regulated by the government. They help usually with varying ailments, conditions, in that regard. They are regulated to help gain control of drug abuse, and these substances are very commonly abused, and I think that's why the government felt the need to be able to control them. The government controls the manufacturing and the distribution of these drugs, so they include narcotics, stimulants, depressants, anabolic steroids, hallucinogens, and they place the substances in 5 schedules to help regulate them. So those schedules are, Schedule 1 is the only one that does not have a medical use, that is not being used for conditions or ailments or anything in that regard. Those are very highly, let me get my wording. Those are the ones that have the most potential for drug abuse. So those include heroin, ecstasy, LSD. Then we also have Schedule 2. There's also a pretty high potential for drug abuse, and there's also some psychological and physical dependency. But there are some that are used for medical purposes and are prescribed and administered in that way. So those could be morphine, fentanyl, methadone, oxycodone. My mom's on oxycodone. And then there's Schedule 3. There's the abuse potential is less than Schedule 1 and 2. So there's still a ability for them to abuse those kinds of drugs, but it is slightly less than the first two. So it will still lead to moderate or low physical and psychological dependency. And then it usually is anabolic steroids, ketamine, Tylenol with codeine, those kinds of drugs. And so for Schedule 4, the potential is even less for abuse. So those contain propoxyphene, I can't pronounce these, sibutramine, and then Schedule 5 is the least potential. So those would be like the over-the-counter cold medicines that have Robitussin, that have codeine, things like that, that would are not as likely you're going to get addicted to them or abuse them. I mean, that's not to say it doesn't happen, but it's less potential for that. Then I'm going to talk about the explosive trains. So this was a quote that I found explaining what they are, and it really helped me because I had a lot of trouble trying to figure out what they were. So what I could find about that is it was an explosive train is a series of combustible or explosive components arranged in order of decreasing sensitivity, designed to initiate explosives. So it has 3 parts, 3 components to it: the detonator, the booster, and the main charge. The detonator is essentially the trigger. It kickstarts the explosion and is usually the first wave of the train. These can be initiated mechanically, electronically, or chemically, although chemically is a little more rare. The booster is essentially the bridge between the detonator and the main charge. So it does help to heighten the explosion, if I'm explaining this properly. And then the main charge is the primary explosive. So it really, the main charge will do the most damage and cause the, and then if you couple that, say, with accelerants or secondary explosive devices or trailers, then it's going to cause it to be even more deadly in that regard. And yeah, so that's all I'm going to talk about for the PowerPoint presentation. My paper is extremely long. I think I'm going on like page 28 at this point. I'm just finding it very difficult to keep it down to a minimum of 1 page per topic. So it'll be long and it'll explain a lot more in detail than I did on my PowerPoint. But yeah, I think that's all. Thank you for listening, and I have really enjoyed this class, so thank you very much. I appreciate it.